So I originally intended for this video to go up on Thanksgiving Day, but unfortunately, because I've been very busy and haven't had as much time to work on videos as I really hoped, I ultimately wasn't able to get this video done for Thanksgiving Day itself. That said, for those of you who do celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you all had a great one this year, and to mark the occasion, I wanted to take a look back at the original Sid Meier's Civilization, originally released for various PC systems of the early 90s, with the versions that are most immediately familiar to everyone mainly being the DOS, Windows 3.1, and Macintosh versions, although it was also available for the PC 98 series in Japan as well as Amiga. And interestingly enough, there were also a few console versions of the game. There was one for the SNES, as well as in Japan only, there were an original PlayStation version, as well as a Sega Saturn version. And what you'll be seeing throughout this video is the DOS version. This is a turn-based strategy game by Microprose that originally released in 1991 for DOS and was later ported to other systems, and in addition to being a huge success when it originally came out and spawning the now legendary Sid Meier's Civilization series, and it's effectively the foundation of what would become the 4X subgenre of strategy games. And I say what would become the subgenre because you have to remember that in 1991, when the original Civilization released, there really wasn't even a distinction between real-time and turn-based strategy games, let alone specific types of either of them. So we are very much going back to ancient times when it comes to the history of strategy video games specifically, and the idea of the 4X genre really wouldn't be established until at least a couple of years later, when the term 4X was applied to the game Master of Orion, and the X's stand for the X's in the words explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So by that point, the idea of the 4X strategy game as a distinct subgenre is more or less solidified, but the original Civilization is more or less the bedrock of the genre. The ideas that this game presents would ultimately define what the 4X genre became. So needless to say, the original Civilization is an extremely important game in the history of the strategy genre specifically, but just video games in general. It has absolutely cemented itself as a legendary title and gave rise to a series that is still extremely popular to this day, and a subgenre of strategy game that has become incredibly successful to this day. But while there is absolutely no denying the original Civilization's legacy, there's a very important question that gets lost when you look only at its historical legacy, and that is how it is as a turn-based strategy game and a 4X game, certainly one of the foundational examples of it, but a 4X game nonetheless, and whether or not it's something that you should go out of your way to pick up a copy of and give a try today. And over the course of this video, I hope to answer that question, but before I really start delving into the particulars, let me give you a bit of historical context for me with the Civilization series, because it is important to understand where I'm coming from on this. I did not play the original Civilization back in the day. I have absolutely no nostalgia for it whatsoever. In fact, I don't even have any nostalgia for Civilization 2. The first game in the series I played was actually Civilization 3. And prior to making this video, I had at the very least messed around with pretty much every other game in the series except for the original Civilization. So here's another question to answer throughout this video. Does knowledge of subsequent Civilization games make it a lot easier to go back to the original, or do you have to unlearn what you've learned? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into this and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, although you have to keep in mind that for strategy games, things are a bit different than if you're, say, looking at an action-adventure game or a first-person shooter or something like that. Graphics generally don't matter all that much in a strategy game unless there's something that actively interferes with your ability to play the game, because what is far more important in a strategy game than simply looking good is the amount of information that is quickly and easily conveyed to the player. And for its time, the original Civilization does a decent job of that. You have to keep in mind that we're dealing with a game that released in 1991, and it is entirely composed of 2D pixel art that is extremely low resolution. Unit graphics consist of basically a tile with a background color denoting who the player that particular unit belongs to is, and a very simplistic pixel art graphic telling you what the unit unit itself is, and with most of those unit graphics, you can barely even tell what they're supposed to represent. Now, the amount of options you have in the original Civilization for units, buildings, etc. are so limited that you can pretty easily memorize what everything is, but it is still going to take some time, and it's not like with later entries in the series where you can just glance at a unit and immediately tell what it's supposed to be, both from its icon and just from its general appearance, because the further you get into the series, the more refined this idea of quickly conveying information to the player became. The original game, on the other hand, just doesn't really have any of those kinds of improvements. I mean, it doesn't even have a technology tree listed anywhere in the game. It's just a list of technologies organized alphabetically. It does at least give you some information about what things are in the interface and where you can find certain types of information, more specifically the listings of all of the game's technologies, units, buildings, etc., and exactly what those things do, as well as a historical blurb about them, and so on and so forth. And compared to other strategy games of the era, most of the information that you need to play the game is conveyed to you in a relatively reasonable manner. But there are a few things that are noticeably absent that people who've played later entries in the series are probably going to scratch their heads at and wonder what they were thinking with this one. Things like having absolutely no indication of a civilization's borders. Not even some indication on the overworld map as to the control radius of cities, so you can tell exactly which tiles they control. Now, of course, things like that were addressed in subsequent entries in the series, even as early as just Civ 2, but it does make the experience of going back and trying to mess around with the original Civilization a bit awkward, and it really doesn't help that the user interface just isn't as intuitive as later games in the series. But I'll expand on that more when I get to the gameplay section. As for the rest of the visuals, despite the very low-res pixel art, the game does have a certain amount of charm to it, particularly with the leader graphics. This is something that would be expanded upon greatly in subsequent games, but even as far back as the original Civ, whenever you're engaging in diplomacy with the leader of another civilization, the colorful pixel art and the extremely simplistic 1 and 2 frame animations do actually give the game a fair bit of charm. At least as much as a game like this could muster in 1991 anyway. Now, unfortunately, the same can't really be said when you move over into sound design, because there's not much going on there really at all. Now, of course, this is limited to the sound effects and the music. There's no voice acting in the game at all, and despite the game supporting dedicated sound hardware like a Sound Blaster, for example, almost none of it really stands out. There are a few tracks in the soundtrack that are alright, and they do have a bit of charm to them, but the sound effects themselves are extremely primitive and barely even a step above PC speaker noises. They're at least not quite as grating as those, but you can barely even tell what the sound effects are even trying to go for. And while the soundtrack does have some charm to it, and it's decent enough for the time and for a PC strategy game anyway, unfortunately, most of the time you're playing the game, it's to the wonderful sounds of absolutely nothing, because the soundtrack only kicks in during certain specific gameplay sections. For example, during the intro sequence where it talks about, "In the beginning, the earth was formless and void," and all that kind of stuff. And of course, if you get a game over or a victory, and it also kicks in when you're engaging in diplomacy or when certain other specific gameplay conditions are triggered. There's no general background music in this like there would be in subsequent games in the series, however, so again, most of the time you're just listening to absolutely nothing except when occasionally a unit attacks another unit and you get a single sound effect played, or if you complete a building and it'll play a small flourish just to note that, hey, this building is complete, and that's pretty much it. So the presentation, while certainly solid enough for a 1991 strategy game, has unfortunately aged quite poorly in the grand scheme of things, and it really does make this game feel more archaic than simply retro classic. But of course, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, although Civilization doesn't really have a story so much as it just has a very basic setup, which is that you pick a civilization to lead from its humble beginnings in the Stone Age all the way up to world domination either through conquest, science, or standing the test of time. Although, let's be honest, with the original Civ, the actual victory condition is almost exclusively going to be conquest. It's the simplest and most straightforward way to win. You just completely eradicate all of the other civilizations and you win. The other two ways of winning are that you build a spaceship and send it off to Alpha Centauri, and when the ship arrives, the game has a sort of soft ending where it tallies up your score, and after that you can keep playing until the actual time limit, but you won't actually accrue any more score. Or if you're doing the test of time ending, then you just go until the game's actual time limit expires, upon which, if you are the highest scoring civilization, then you win. The thing is, by the time you get to the actual time limit of the game, or of course to the point where you can build the starship going to Alpha Centauri, you've probably already wiped out most of, not all of the competition on the map anyway, so most of the time you're going to be winning through conquest. But regardless of which victory condition you're going for, the real meat of the game and what actually makes it interesting is the build up to that point, how you actually build out your civilization and try to make it thrive. This is all accomplished in a turn-based format that starts in the year 4000 BC and goes all the way up to 2100 AD in the case of the easiest difficulty of Chieftain, and decreasing the amount of years in increments of 20 until you get to the hardest difficulty in this particular game being Emperor, with the turn limit there being the year 2020. On any given turn, you're going to be doing two primary actions. Those are controlling the production of your various cities and controlling all of your various units. With city production, most of what you're going to be doing there is just selecting whatever the city happens to be building, although you can move the citizens of that city around so that they're working different tiles within the city's boundaries if you want to optimize production a certain way. Each city produces 4 basic resources, if you can really call them that, which are food, industrial production, usually just shortened to production, technology, and commerce, or what the manual refers to, cash. And the main things you need to understand with these resources are that food controls the growth rate of cities. The city needs to produce enough food to maintain its current population, and if it has a surplus of food, then it will gradually grow its population. The higher the population of a city, the more production it's going to have, the more tax revenue it's going to have, and so on and so forth. So you want your cities to get bigger. Thus, you want to make sure that your city has plenty of food. You also want to make sure that it has plenty of production, because that is going to control how quickly it constructs buildings within the city itself, as well as how quickly it trains units. You also want to make sure it has a good amount of commerce, because that will offset maintenance costs of the various buildings that you've constructed in a particular city, as well as the maintenance costs of units. And if you have a surplus of commerce production across your entire empire, then it is going to put more money into your reserves, and not only can you use that to hurry production of units and structures, but you also will be using it as part of diplomacy, and you might end up having barbarians raiding your settlements and occasionally stealing your money, so it's important to have a good surplus of it. And aside from simply gearing up your city to produce more commerce on its own, you can also train caravans and send them to especially foreign cities to establish trade routes, but you can even send them to domestic cities as well to also establish trade routes, which in turn will also increase the amount of commerce that a particular city is generating. And then, of course, the amount of research you generate in a particular city contributes to how quickly you're going to make technological advances. There's also an additional resource called luxuries that cities can produce but don't do so by default, because that is something that is controlled on an empire level. You see, you have two options to set the rate of luxuries as well as the general tax rate, and it tells you the amount of taxes going towards just your general coffers versus your science, and then if you adjust the luxury rate, which just starts at 0%, then you'll be allocating some production and taxing to the luxuries cities, which will then make citizens in the cities happy, or at least content, and that's important to avoid civil disorder. If enough citizens become unhappy in a particular city, then the city will enter a state of civil disorder, and any production that was going on in that city will cease until you can restore order either by adjusting the luxury rate or constructing certain buildings in the city that will offset the happiness penalties, or allocating citizens to become entertainers so that they specifically produce luxuries. Or, of course, for certain government types that you have access to in the game, you can just station more military units in there and impose martial law until disorder is ended, and then you can figure out a better solution from one of the other methods. As your empire continues to expand and your cities get more and more built up, obviously the maintenance costs are going to increase, and it's going to become a bit of a delicate balancing act sometimes. Especially considering you can't simply allocate a city's production entirely towards commerce like you can in later entries in the series. It has to either be building a structure within the city or training a unit. There's no wealth or luxuries or research that you can allocate so that the city is effectively in maintenance mode. This ultimately means that any strategy you try to create going into Civ 1 is going to be focused very heavily on rapid and aggressive expansion. Simply put, the more cities you have, the higher your population is going to be, the more tax revenue you're going to generate, and the more you're going to be able to offset maintenance costs of buildings and units. Any situation where you're solely looking after the territory you already cover and you're building up your cities and such is really only temporary. Eventually you are going to have to start expanding again because eventually those maintenance costs will keep piling up. And this is, of course, where unit controls are going to come into play, because a lot of the expansion you're going to be doing is going to be centered around conquest, whether that be conquering barbarians who show up in different areas and harass your cities, or, of course, attempting to conquer other civilizations. In this regard, everything is very simple. Every single unit has an attack and a defense rating. During combat, which stat is going to be relevant is going to depend, of course, on what that particular unit is doing, if it's being attacked by something else or if it's doing the attacking. And while you might logically think that something with a higher attack stat going up against something with a lower defense stat is going to win every encounter, that's not actually how things work. Generally speaking, if something has a higher attack value than the thing it's going after's defense value, it's going to have an advantage in combat. But every single combat encounter is actually a dice roll. You can have things with considerably higher attack stats going up against things with very low defense stats and still losing regularly, because at the end of the day, everything is up to chance. The numbers just help to balance things a bit more in your favor. This is something that newer players of Civilization who've entered the series with 5 or 6 are not going to understand, because by that point, the dice rolling element is more or less removed. It's much more hard stat values being important, and you can buff those stat values up by doing things like fortifying units in cities, or fortifying them in fortresses, or something along those lines. You can kind of do that in the original Civ as well, but it just gives a bonus to whatever the defender's defense stat is, and that only helps so much when everything really is up to chance. This was always one of the most frustrating elements of Civilization's gameplay prior to Civilization 5, because that's when they changed things up. Prior to Civilization 5, it really wasn't that uncommon to have, for example, Stone Age archers going up against modern-day armored vehicles, and the armored vehicles are the ones that lose. It's a phenomenon that does get a bit rarer between Civ 1, 2, and 3, and then by the time you get to Civ 4, they introduced enough extra values to where it doesn't happen anywhere near as much, although it can still happen. But at the end of the day, it all results in combat where you just get a big stack of units and you send them up against another big stack of units, and you hope that the dice rolls come out in your favor by the end of it. And while this can certainly create some interesting and often downright wacky situations where, For example, you have Stone Age archers defeating modern-day tanks, and that can be legitimately amusing. Unfortunately, it also means that a major element of what is supposed to be a strategy game is far more predicated on luck than any kind of strategic acumen that player possesses. And in the original Civilization in particular, this is far more of a problem considering how simplistic this game is overall. Every single unit can only attack something that is adjacent to it, whether it's a melee unit or a ranged unit or an artillery piece. It doesn't matter, it can only attack something that is in the tile directly adjacent to it. And thus, every single combat in this game goes basically the exact same. You just have a stack of units, and then you just move it into another stack of units until either you run out of units or they run out of units. It just makes combat more of a tedious chore than anything else, and while at least in Civ 3 and 4 you had animations to help with making the combat a bit more interesting, in Civ 1 there aren't any combat animations. It's just a unit icon moving into another unit icon, and then it either just poofs away or it stays there. To make matters worse in this regard, you have to keep in mind that this game released in 1991, and unit pathfinding was an extremely new thing. And, of course, Civilization 1's unit pathfinding is absolutely terrible. So, using the go-to function and trying to select somewhere to move a unit on the map with the mouse ends up actually being the exact wrong thing to do most of the time, because they'll usually end up blundering their way into enemies, or if it's, say, a trireme, which can't stay in ocean water, it'll just blunder off into the ocean and then sink. Thus, the best way to maneuver units around the map is not to use the mouse at all, it's to use the number pad. Because you can use the arrow keys to move north, south, east, and west, but what about if you need to move diagonally? You can't do that with arrow keys, you have to do it with the number pad. Which is, of course, a problem if you're using a lot of modern keyboards, because a lot of modern keyboards don't have number pads. And in fact, while I'm on the subject of keyboard controls, I should mention that the mouse controls in this game really aren't very good either. There's relatively few things you can actually do with the mouse in this game, and the interface is rather spotty on how it actually interacts with your mouse cursor. Sometimes you'll think you're clicking on something, but it's not registering the click where you think you're clicking, and that can get pretty annoying. So most of the time you're playing this, you're probably going to be relying almost exclusively on keyboard commands. Thankfully, the game is fairly easy to navigate with keyboard commands, and it's abundantly clear right from the beginning that that's how they designed the game to be played. But for strategy games in particular, that makes them feel downright archaic, and more importantly, it's really tedious to navigate the menus and the unit controls in this game. When you want to move, say, a stack of units in this game, there's no group command. You can't just group a stack together and then move the stack. You have to move each individual unit in that stack every single turn. It gets incredibly tedious after a while, especially once you get a large empire with a lot of units to move around. And unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with the units either. You can move them around, you can move them into other units or enemy cities in order to attack them. You can order them to fortify, which will make them stay idle on a particular tile, and they'll gain a defensive bonus. You can order them to sentry, in which case they remain idle on a particular tile, but whenever an enemy moves within range, then they'll activate again and you can maneuver them. You can tell them to wait, at which point it will move to the next active unit, so you can do whatever you need to do with that unit, and you will eventually get back to the unit you ordered to wait, and then you can decide what you want to do with them. Or you can have them skip a turn. And that's pretty much it. There are a couple of exceptions, namely in the case of naval vessels, where you can load land units into a naval vessel and then unload them somewhere else. So that's how you transport them across seas. And in the case of settlers, you can order them to build improvements on tiles, which will be things like mines, which will improve production, or irrigation, which will improve food production, or you can have them build roads, which will improve commerce production, and they will also give a movement speed bonus to any unit that's moving over them, because whenever a unit moves over a road tile, they only use a third of a movement point instead of a full movement point. And you can upgrade those to railroads later on, where the units will actually use no movement points at all as long as they're moving along railroad tiles. Settlers can also build fortresses, which will allow units to get a defensive bonus whenever they're on those tiles, and once you get far enough into the game and pollution starts to spread around the map, they can clean up pollution. But of course, the most important thing a settler can do is found a city, and that's something that would change pretty dramatically in later entries in the Civ series. They would differentiate worker units from settler units. Settlers would spin off into only being able to found cities, or even simply increase the population of a city that they're sent to, and worker units would then be able to build all the improvements, clean pollution, that sort of thing. But back in the original civilization, that was all done by simply settler units. And that brings me to something else that's important to mention. The settler has the most functions out of any unit in the game, but even those functions are pretty simple, and of course the movement is the same as any other unit. Sea units can of course move only in sea tiles, land units can only move in land tiles, air units can move over land or sea, but regardless of which unit you're talking about, everything is very simple and straightforward, and there are rather few units in this game in general. In fact, there's barely anything to differentiate any given civilization from another. Apart from the simple flavor of playing, say, the Romans or the Babylonians or the Aztecs or whatever, the only actual mechanical difference between any of the civilizations is which two technologies they start with. Since all of the graphics are so simplistic, the only real way you differentiate them from a glance is on the diplomacy screen when it shows you what the leader looks like, and that's where all of the personality of the civilizations comes from, because there aren't any unique units or anything like that to really differentiate them. And this results in pretty much every single civilization feeling almost the exact same to play as. This is something that would dramatically improve later in the series. They would really start to differentiate the civilizations a lot more. But back in the original game, it's all very homogeneous. The only real personality you get there with the various factions is when you're playing against them and you interact with their various leaders, all of whom have different values for things like how aggressive they are versus how civil they are, and so on and so forth. But of course that doesn't help you out at all when you're actually playing that civilization. And even if you do try to play to the personalities of the various leaders and try to establish good relations with their civilizations, the diplomacy in the original civilization is so primitive that it's basically non-existent. In fact, most of the functions of the diplomat unit that you have to send into other civilizations' territory just to be able to talk to their leader without them specifically trying to talk to you first are actually what later entries in the series would classify as espionage. You can establish embassies to get intelligence reports on those civilizations and investigate cities to see what they're doing, steal technologies, and try to sabotage the city's production or incite a revolt that will allow you to gain control of some of their units and declare war on them immediately. The only actual diplomatic action that the diplomat can take is simply to meet with the leader of that civilization, and about all you can really do with those is declare war or try to trade technologies, but that's pretty much it. And the end result of all of this is that while the original Civilization was certainly a captivating and revolutionary game back in 1991, the amount of improvements that later entries in the series, even as early as Civ 2 introduced, effectively rendered the original game obsolete. It is still cool to look back on this game from a historical perspective and see where all of the core mechanics of the Civilization series got their start, and they're relatively unchanged in their core form ever since the original Civ. You can go back to this and have a grasp of the core mechanics almost immediately if you've ever played another Civ game. It's just a lot of the particulars are a lot more primitive here, and if you started with the series as of Civ 3 or newer, then the idea of having settlers building all the tile improvements as well as being able to found cities is going to be pretty strange to you, and the idea of only being able to trade with other nations by using specific caravan units is going to be kind of odd to you. But all of the basics, the researching technologies, improving your cities, creating units and moving them around to fight other empires and barbarians and such, founding cities and building them up over time, dealing with your often and very belligerent neighbors, and ultimately becoming the one civilization to rule over them all, it's all very familiar if you've played any other game in the Civ series. It's just that this one, by comparison, is so primitive that it is very difficult to go back to unless you, at the very least, have played a fair amount of Civ 2, and even then, it's still gonna be a really rough experience because even Civ 2 pretty dramatically improved the general gameplay experience of the Civilization series. And the more recently in the series you started, and the fewer of the earlier games you've played, the more difficult it's going to be. I mean, I started playing this series as of Civ 3, and that was an improved and refined version of Civ 2, which itself was an improved and refined version of Civ 1, so even being pretty comfortable with the older gameplay style of the Civilization series, the original game is just really hard to go back to, and I have a very difficult time recommending anyone do so, unless they're just really interested in the game from a historical standpoint, because it is really interesting to look at as a piece of gaming history. But if you're actually looking to play and enjoy your experience with the Civilization series, maybe you should look into Civ 3, 5, and 6 instead. Obviously, they're going to be infinitely more accessible, and you're going to find they're a lot easier to get into and quickly start enjoying, whereas the original Civilization just feels downright archaic and is really best remembered for its legacy rather than actually played these days. But for those of you who do like going back and looking at these kind of historical curiosities in gaming, just know what you're getting yourself into on this one, because it's a pretty rough experience, and even Civ 2 is a dramatically more accessible and far more enjoyable game than Civ 1 is. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me on the past several weeks as far as video production has gone, or really more not gone. It has been very busy over the past month or so since I've been adjusting to a new work schedule. I've had a bunch of things I just needed to do all at once, and I'm hoping that things are going to stabilize a bit more in the coming weeks, but we're just going to have to play it by ear, and again, I just really appreciate your patience on that. I mean, I still haven't even managed to get my birthday review done this year. It's still in the works, I just haven't been able to get it finished, and I wanted to go ahead and get something out for Thanksgiving, but then Thanksgiving came and went, and I didn't have time to finish it up, so it's just been a mess. So again, very much appreciate your patience. To those of you who support the channel on Patreon, thanks for bearing with me. Thank you all very much for your support. And if you like the videos I make and you want to help support the channel, then Patreon is the best way to do that. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out the channel. But if you can't afford to support the channel or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. It's just the option's there if you're interested. And again, every bit really does help out. So thank you all very much for watching. I'm going to get back to working on videos as I can here. Like I said, it's just been really busy, so I can't necessarily make any guarantees as I'm recording this audio right now. But hopefully things will stabilize within the next couple of weeks, and I'll be able to get some more regular video production up and going again. We'll just have to wait and see, though. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.